These guys didn't know what the they were doing. 2010, Al Davis. For 30 years, Al Davis was the guy, the mastermind, the ultimate football rebel. He built the Raiders into an empire, and for a long time, all they did was win. 3 Super Bowls, relentless swagger, and a front office that wasn't afraid to challenge the NFL establishment. He was once the best general manager in football. But by 2010, Al Davis was playing checkers while everyone else was playing chess. The Raiders were in a full decade of dysfunction, and Davis, who was now in his old age, still had full control over roster decisions. And he was working with a scouting philosophy straight out of Tecmo Bowl. His strategy was just to draft the fastest guy possible and assume football skills were optional. Like in the case of Darrius Heyward-Bey. The 2009 draft should have been a wake-up call. The Raiders had the 7th overall pick and needed a real offensive weapon. Michael Crabtree was sitting there, polished, productive, clearly the best receiver prospect in the class. But Darrius Heyward-Bey ran a 4.340 according to Al's trusty stopwatch, and that was all he needed to see. It didn't matter that he had the hands of a bricklayer or ran routes like a GPS without signal. Speed was speed. By 2010, the Heyward-Bey disaster was obvious, but Davis doubled down. He spent the draft reaching for athletes over actual players, and free agency wasn't much better. He wasted the 8th overall pick on Rolando McClain, who had the football instincts of a traffic cone. Then he gave cornerback Stanford Routt a $32 million extension right after the 2010 season. He was released 1 year later. But the weirdest part? Despite all this, the Raiders somehow went 8-8 by sweeping the division in 2010. And that was the worst thing that could have happened because it convinced Al Davis that there was still a method to his madness. But the NFL had evolved, and the Raiders had not. And by the time Davis passed away in 2011, the franchise was buried under years of mismanagement, bizarre contracts, and a draft strategy that might as well have been who runs the fastest. For decades, Al Davis was ahead of his time, but by 2010, time had officially caught up. 2011, Gene Smith. It takes a special kind of talent to be arguably a worse general manager than Matt Millen, who engineered the 0-16 Lions. You have to go out of your way to ruin a franchise, making every possible mistake while somehow thinking you're still the smartest guy in the room. And that's exactly what Gene Smith did. From 2009 to 2012, he tore down a Jaguars franchise that actually had a pretty prosperous little mid-2000s run. His draft philosophy? Ignore Power 5 schools and load up on small school hidden gems who were hidden for a reason. By the time he was done, Jacksonville had collected more anonymous football players than an NFL Europe alumni meeting. 2011 was the year Smith really flexed his scouting genius. With the 10th pick in the draft, he decided that Blaine Gabbert was the guy. Never mind that Gabbert's college tape showed a quarterback who treated pressure like a haunted house. He had long hair, a good frame, and looked the part. So naturally, the Jaguars traded up to get him. And Gabbert immediately repaid them by playing quarterback like a guy who won a contest to be an NFL starter for a season. Smith wasn't done, though. Later drafts brought in Justin Blackmon, who had serious talent but barely saw the field before he got lost in a DUI simulator. And let's not forget Brian Anger, the punter, whom Smith drafted in the 3rd round, 5 picks before Russell Wilson. As bad as his draft picks were, Gene Smith's free agency moves might have been even worse. He spent real money on veterans who held up worse than a piñata at a baseball bat convention. He signed Laurent Robinson to a $33 million deal after the 2011 season. The wide receiver suffered 4 concussions that year and never played again. Aaron Ross called his time in Jacksonville a paid vacation, the most honest thing ever said about Jaguars free agency. But at least Gene Smith found one good player, Paul Posluszny, the owner of the biggest neck in NFL history. A tough old-school linebacker who couldn't cover a rock, but at least he hit people hard. By the time 2011 was over, Gene Smith still had one move left in his how to ruin a franchise playbook, hiring Mike Mularkey as the head coach. The man whose only plan was, it, let's hand it off to Maurice Jones-Drew. Gene Smith was fired after the 2012 season, leaving behind a roster full of bad contracts, busted draft picks, and a city full of fans who spent the next decade in NFL purgatory. 2012, Mike Tannenbaum. Mike Tannenbaum wasn't always a bad general manager. In fact, for a few years, he looked like one of the smartest in the league. He built a team that made back-to-back AFC Championship appearances in 2009 and 2010, surrounding a young Mark Sanchez with an elite defense and a punishing run game. But by 2012, that team was a distant memory. Tannenbaum had completely ignored long-term roster building and made one move that officially cemented his place as the worst GM of the year. The Tim Tebow trade. Let's set the scene. The Jets had just extended Mark Sanchez despite the fact that he had regressed significantly in 2011. Then, instead of surrounding him with weapons or protection, Tannenbaum decided to trade for Tim Tebow. Not as a starter, not as a full-time backup, but I guess as a gadget player? No one really knew. Tebow was fresh off his magical run with the Broncos. The guy had one defining skill, running an option-heavy offense that the Jets had no intention of running. The trade made absolutely no sense, and even worse, it immediately created suspense. Because the second Sanchez started struggling, which, let's be real, was inevitable, everyone was going to call for Tim Tebow. Rex Ryan had no idea what to do with him. The Jets barely used him outside of some gimmicky Wildcat packages, and he ended the season with 8 total passes thrown and 32 rushing attempts. The Tebow trade was just the most public humiliation, but the entire 2012 offseason was a disaster. Tannenbaum handed Santonio Holmes a massive extension in 2011, but by 2012 he was injured, unmotivated, and openly feuding with teammates. He also drafted Quentin Coples when the Jets needed offensive firepower. Coples was a defensive lineman who had all the tools but lacked effort and never became more than a rotational guy. By the end of 2012, the Jets and Mark Sanchez became the laughingstock of the league thanks to the butt fumble. Tannenbaum was fired after the season, but his legacy lived on. Years of no real offensive weapons and a team that had gone from Super Bowl contender to a joke in record time. The Tebow trade alone should have gotten him banned from ever running another team, but he eventually landed a job with the Dolphins, where things didn't really go any better. 2013, Mike Lombardi. Mike Lombardi spent years as an NFL analyst, a guy who built a reputation as a football genius while sitting behind a microphone. But he had spent some time working in the NFL too. So in 2013, the Cleveland Browns decided, hey, let's see if this guy actually knows what he's talking about. Turns out, he didn't. Lombardi lasted 1 season as the Browns GM, and in that short time, he managed to make every mistake possible. The 2013 season was an absolute train wreck, and when you look at his decisions, it's actually impressive how bad he was at this job. The Browns had the 6th overall pick in the draft. This was a chance to add a franchise-changing player. Now, in fairness, this was one of the worst draft classes of all time, but Lombardi made the brilliant decision to draft Barkevious Mingo, who had an awesome name, elite athleticism, and absolutely no pass-rushing moves. He was the classic looks great in shorts guy, someone who dominated the NFL Combine but forgot to actually learn how to play football. In 3 years with the Browns, he had 7 total sacks. Cleveland also entered 2013 with Brandon Weeden at quarterback, a 30-year-old in his second year who had already proven he wasn't the guy. But Lombardi's best attempt at fixing the quarterback situation was duct taping over it with Brian Hoyer and Jason Campbell. Here's the one thing Lombardi actually got right. He traded Trent Richardson to the Colts for a first-round pick. Now, at the time, people actually thought this was a terrible move. Richardson had just been drafted 3rd overall in 2012, and the Colts thought they were getting a franchise running back. But instead, they got a guy who ran like he had a blindfold on. The trade was a fleecing, but because it was the Browns, they ultimately turned that pick into Johnny Manziel. So, in the end, it didn't even matter. Lombardi also apparently hated the coaching staff, and after the season, he and the front office randomly fired head coach Rob Chudzinski after just 1 year. This sent the Browns into full-on chaos mode. Nobody wanted the job, and they ended up hiring Mike Pettin, who was about as uninspiring as it gets. Sadly, Lombardi didn't even get to enjoy the mess he was making. After 1 season, Cleveland ownership realized the mistake they'd made and fired him. Mike Lombardi talked a big game for years. Then he got a GM job and immediately showed he had no idea what he was doing. 2014, Ray Farmer. Being the general manager of the Cleveland Browns in the 2010s was like hooking up with Sidney Sweeney in a dream. Doesn't last very long. Enter Ray Farmer, a man who had somehow made the worst front office in football even worse. Farmer combined horrible draft picks, reckless roster moves, and a scandal so ridiculous that it genuinely sounds made up. The Browns had not 1 but 2 first-round picks in 2014. 2 chances to change the franchise. But instead they walked away with Justin Gilbert at 8th overall, a corner who had elite athleticism but played like he just won the lottery and then quit his job. He was unmotivated, hated football, and lasted 2 years before getting traded for a 6th-round pick. By 2017, he was out of the league. And then, of course, Johnny Manziel at 22nd overall, the defining pick of Ray Farmer's legacy. Though, in fairness to him, Jimmy Haslam was surely calling the shot on this one. But still, Farmer is guilty by association. The worst part? The Browns had the 4th overall pick before trading down. They could have drafted Khalil Mack, Odell Beckham, Mike Evans. Instead, they ended up with 2 of the biggest busts of the decade, and prayed Josh Gordon could get clean and hold it down at receiver. As if the draft wasn't bad enough, Farmer managed to get himself suspended in 2014 for texting the coaching staff during games. Farmer was literally texting plays to the coaches, trying to micromanage the team from the press box like he was playing Madden. The NFL caught wind of it, and the Browns were fined $250K while Farmer got suspended for the first 4 games of the 2015 season. By the end of 2014, Manziel was already a bust, Gilbert was playing like he was allergic to effort, and Farmer had cemented himself as one of the worst talent evaluators in football. He got fired after the Browns went 3-13 in 2015, and Cleveland hit the reset button again. The Browns have had a lot of terrible GMs, but few did as much damage in as little time as Ray Farmer. 2015, Chip Kelly. Most bad GMs ruin a franchise by accident, but Chip Kelly, it almost seems like he did it on purpose. In 2013 and 2014, he built a fast-paced, innovative offense that took the NFL by storm. But that wasn't enough for Chip Kelly. He wanted total control. He wanted to be Bill Belichick. And how can you blame him? Who doesn't want to be Bill Belichick? So in 2015, when the Eagles gave him full GM power, he wasted no time turning one of the most exciting rosters in football into a catastrophe. The Eagles had been 10-6 in back-to-back years. They weren't perfect, but they were good. But again, that wasn't enough for Chip Kelly. So he gutted the roster, trading LaShawn McCoy for Kiko Alonso. McCoy was 26 years old, an all-pro, and had just rushed for 1,300 yards. Kelly traded him straight up for Kiko Alonso, a linebacker coming off a torn ACL. McCoy kept being a superstar in Buffalo, and Alonso played 1 mediocre year in Philly before getting dumped. He let Jeremy Maclin walk for nothing, after Maclin had 1,300 yards and 10 touchdowns in 2014. The Eagles tried to replace him with Nelson Aguilar, who sucked. They also signed DeMarco Murray to replace McCoy, after he just led the NFL in rushing for the Cowboys, but he didn't fit Kelly's system at all. They gave him $42 million, and it took about a month for everyone to realize it was a disaster. Murray averaged 3.6 yards per carry, openly hated the system, and was traded away after 1 year. And finally, there was the Sam Bradford trade. The Eagles had Nick Foles, who wasn't good in 2014, but he threw 27 touchdowns and 2 picks in 2013. Kelly traded Foles to the Rams for Sam Bradford, talked about how Bradford was the perfect fit for his offense. Then he coached him for a season and got himself fired. The offense fell apart without McCoy and Maclin, the defense collapsed even further, and DeMarco Murray hated everything and stopped trying. By December, the Eagles were getting embarrassed weekly. A 45-17 loss to the Bucs and a 40-17 loss to the Cardinals made it obvious. The Eagles fired Chip Kelly with 1 game left in the season. His only year as GM was like giving a toddler a flamethrower. The moment he was gone, the Eagles immediately started rebuilding. And 2 years later, they won a Super Bowl with the quarterback he traded away. Kelly, meanwhile, went to the 49ers, ruined them for a year, and then left the NFL forever. One of the worst GM stints of all time. 2016, Ryan Grigson. Let's all give a warm welcome to the man who single-handedly ended the career of a generational quarterback. From the moment he was hired in 2012, Grigson was handed the easiest job in the NFL. Build a team around the greatest quarterback prospect of all time. Instead, he treated Andrew Luck like an indestructible crash test dummy. He made horrific personnel decisions and left the Colts in shambles. Andrew Luck was drafted in 2012 and almost immediately started taking absurd amounts of punishment. By 2015, he had a lacerated kidney, a partially torn abdomen, a career-altering shoulder injury, and missed half the season. Yet, Grigson refused to fix the offensive line. Instead of drafting linemen or signing real protection in free agency, Grigson wasted premium picks on skill players who were busts. In 2013, he spent a first-rounder on a pass rusher by the name of Bjorn Werner, who was trash. And then in 2015, he spent a first-rounder on Philip Dorsett, a receiver they didn't need and who wasn't good anyway. By 2016, Luck was being sacked into oblivion, and his injuries were adding up. His throwing shoulder was completely destroyed, and he needed off-season surgery. This was the beginning of the end. And Grigson was also the mastermind that engineered the Trent Richardson trade. Even though that didn't happen in 2016, it still needs to be mentioned. By 2016, it was obvious that Grigson was not the answer. The Colts had no offensive line, the defense was terrible, and the roster was top-heavy and aging. Luck was playing through constant pain, and the team missed the playoffs again. The most absurd part was the fact that Grigson blamed Andrew Luck's contract for his inability to build a good team. By January of 2017, the Colts had finally seen enough and fired Grigson. But the damage was done. Luck's body was breaking down, and the roster had huge holes everywhere. Grigson wasted a once-in-a-generation quarterback. Andrew Luck retired at 29 in 2019 because he was in too much pain. Grigson had the easiest opportunity to build a dynasty. Instead, he built an infirmary. It takes a special kind of GM to make a surefire Hall of Fame quarterback retire before 30. Ryan Grigson was the worst thing that ever happened to Andrew Luck. 2017, Sashi Brown. Brown wasn't a football guy per se. He was a lawyer turned analytics guru who was put in charge of the Cleveland Browns in 2016. His strategy? Hoard draft picks and embrace tanking like it was an Olympic sport. By 2017, his master plan was fully in motion, and the Browns fielded one of the worst rosters in NFL history. The result was an 0-16 season. I'm not sure Sashi Brown believed in actual football players. He believed in assets. In 2016, the Browns had the number 2 overall pick. They traded it away to the Eagles instead of taking Carson Wentz. In 2017, they had the number 1 and number 12 overall picks. They took Myles Garrett first because that's what everyone would have done, but then they traded the number 12 pick to Houston, who used it to draft Deshaun Watson, while the Chiefs jumped up and took Patrick Mahomes at number 10. What'd the Browns do? They drafted Deshaun Kaiser in the second round. He went 0-15 as a starter. Perhaps it wouldn't have mattered anyway, but Sashi Brown acted like drafting quarterbacks was something you could just keep putting off, like me in 8th grade on a Sunday night with 4 hours of homework to do. Meanwhile, actual NFL teams were finding franchise guys while Cleveland sat there counting draft picks. And Sashi Brown's idea of free agency was not participating in it. Other teams signed good players, and the Browns got Brock Osweiler, but not to play, just to take on his contract to get more picks and then cut him. They also gave Kenny Britt $33 million and then cut him before the season ended. Additionally, Deshaun Kaiser was the worst quarterback in the NFL, and not even Myles Garrett could save the Browns' defense. Sashi Brown didn't even get to finish the year. The Browns fired him in December of 2017, realizing that a roster made up of draft picks and practice squad players wasn't sustainable. In the very next year, Cleveland used his picks to draft Baker Mayfield, Denzel Ward, and Nick Chubb. So, in a weird way, his tanking actually worked, but he was so bad at building a team that he never got to see the results. He was a fantastic asset accumulator, but a horrible football GM. Sashi Brown was essentially running a homeless man's version of Moneyball. 2018, Steve Keim. Some GMs make bad draft picks. Others hand out terrible contracts. Steve Keim? He did both while also getting a DUI and briefly disappearing from the team. Keim had been the Cardinals GM since 2013, and for a while the Cardinals were actually pretty filthy. Arizona was competitive under Bruce Arians, Carson Palmer was solid, and in 2015 I'd argue they had the best top-to-bottom roster in the entire league. But in 2018, the Cardinals had one of the worst seasons in franchise history. Horrendous roster moves, a coaching disaster, and a draft pick so bad the team gave up on him after 1 year. After Bruce Arians left the team, the Cardinals needed a new head coach. So Keim hired Steve Wilks, a defensive-minded guy who ran a scheme that didn't fit the roster at all. He was so overmatched that players were openly questioning his game plans within weeks. The team was historically bad from day one, and Wilks was fired after just 1 season. The Cardinals also desperately needed a quarterback, but instead of trading up to take Josh Allen or just drafting Lamar Jackson, Keim traded up to take Josh Rosen, a guy who then said that there were 9 mistakes made ahead of him on draft night. He also lasted 1 year before Arizona replaced him with Kyler Murray in 2019. Then there was the Sam Bradford disaster. Keim signed Bradford, who was practically in a wheelchair at this point, to a 1-year, $20 million contract to be the bridge quarterback. Bradford got benched in Week 3, and the Cardinals cut him in November, paying him $15 million guaranteed for nothing. With Wilks as the coach, Rosen at QB, and literally no offensive line, the Cardinals limped to a 3-13 record. And to add insult to injury, in July of 2018, Keim was arrested for driving under the influence. He was suspended for 5 weeks. After the 2018 season, the Cardinals fired Wilks, drafted Kyler number 1 overall, and traded Josh Rosen for pennies. Keim eventually helped turn things around slightly with Kyler Murray, but 2018 was a total disaster, and Keim was the architect. He somehow kept his job until 2022, when he decided to step away to focus on his health. 2019, John Gruden and Mike Mayock. When the Raiders brought John Gruden back in 2018 with a 10-year, $100 million contract, they thought they were getting the mastermind who built their early 2000s powerhouse. But he was no longer the offensive genius running circles around the rest of the league, and he drafted like he was throwing darts blindfolded. To complete the circus, the Raiders also hired Mike Mayock, an NFL Network draft analyst with zero front office experience. On paper, Mayock was supposed to bring scouting expertise, while Gruden called the shots. In reality, they combined forces to make some of the worst roster decisions of the decade. Gruden's first move as the Raiders' de facto GM was gutting the roster of elite talent, though in his defense, some of it was against his will. Khalil Mack was the best player on the team, and arguably the best defensive player in the league at the time. But Gruden had little choice but to trade him to Chicago, so they didn't have to give him a massive extension. Amari Cooper was traded to Dallas mid-season for a similar reason. Maybe John Gruden himself didn't really want to make these trades. Okay, fair enough. But what did he and Mayock do with all these high-end picks? The Raiders had 3 first-rounders in 2019, a rare chance to reshape the team. So let's see how that went. The Raiders stunned everyone by taking Clelin Ferrell 4th overall, a guy who was projected to go mid to late first round. He had 10 total sacks in 4 years. They could have drafted Devin White, Brian Burns, Dexter Lawrence. Instead, they burned a top 5 pick on a guy that didn't make it to his second contract. Then they took Josh Jacobs 24th. This was a good pick. Jacobs became a Pro Bowl running back, but he didn't move the needle much in terms of actually winning. And then they took Jonathan Abram 27th, a hard-hitting safety who played like he was trying to get ejected. He struggled in coverage, was constantly injured, and off the team in 2022. Another first-round bust. Josh Jacobs and 2 colossal busts weren't going to replace Khalil Mack and Amari Cooper. But the worst move of all wasn't even in the draft. It was trading for Antonio Brown. They gave up a 3rd and 5th rounder for Brown, thinking they were getting an all-time great who would transform their offense. But it turned out they were getting one of the most chaotic players in NFL history. He never played a single snap for the Raiders. But he did show up to his first practice in a hot air balloon, freeze-fry his feet in a cryotherapy chamber, refused to practice because of a helmet dispute, publicly trash the team on Instagram, get into a screaming match with Mike Mayock, and then demand his release. With a bad draft and a roster built on bad free agency signings such as Trent Brown's $66 million deal, the Raiders limped to a 7-9 record. The defense was terrible, Derek Carr was stuck in neutral like he's been for a decade, Clelin Ferrell was invisible, and Antonio Brown was gone before the season started. It was obvious Gruden and Mayock's plan was a bit sloppy. They stuck around for a few more years, but 2019 set the tone for everything that followed. More wasted draft picks like Henry Ruggs, and no clear direction. By 2021, Gruden resigned in disgrace after his email scandal, and Mike Mayock was fired in January of 2022. The Gruden and Mayock era was as anticlimactic as it gets. Massive hype and excitement followed by incompetence. A front office that thought it was outsmarting the NFL while actively making the worst possible decisions.